Hi, everybody. My name is Phil Jones. I am just doing this little presentation, really for mainly for the Facebook community who are interested in Jackson C. Frank, who are really kind and encouraging me in terms of my presentation that I gave last week. A little bit of context here. I'm in England, though I'm from Wales. I live on the south coast of England in Sussex, near Brighton. For those of you in the States who'd like to look it up, I live on a houseboat. Let me just show you, see if I can show you out the window there. You can see it's sort of sitting on the mud. The tide's out at the minute. I live on a I live in a site of special scientific interest. There's lots of great birds and stuff out there. Anyway, thank you for my support around Jackson C. Frank, and I thought I would just do this um, as a thank you, really. I was asked to do a sort of 15-minute talk at a local speakers club, which is just a great night. You know, I've been along there lots of times. There was a guy on with me the other week talking about his collection of lawn mowers. I've seen people talk about what's in their bedroom. Somebody else talking about what they found in books. Another person talking about virtual reality as a therapeutic tool, all sorts of stuff. Anyway, I was talking about Jackson C. Frank, and I was my intention was to give people some those who didn't know anything about Jackson to tell them about him. People who did know maybe a little bit more. As I got there, there was 30 people there. One person had heard of him, so I was in good shape really. Okay, so this is just my take. I've read the Jim Abbott book. I've done my research. If I get something wrong, please please don't write. Um, I'm not professing to be an expert. I've got no axe to grind here. I've got nothing to sell. I'm just sharing my stuff with you. Okay, and I already know that actually there's a mistake on the first screen because I realised it as I said it. Was that, of course, Jackson was born 2nd of March 1943, not 44. So I've changed that already. Um, I wanted to talk about him really because I felt that he was just overlooked, wasn't he? I think I can't remember his birth. Jan, she said, best folk song singer you've never heard of, and I think that's true. I think he was a wonderful singer and a wonderful guitar player and a wonderful songwriter. And I think his life was bookended by tragedy. You can't read anything about Jackson C. Frank without thinking about tragedy. Which caused me some problems really because I didn't want to be an ambulance chaser. I didn't want to turn people into gulpers. Um, However, I wanted to tell the full story. I was very interested to see the Elvis film, Baz Luhrmann's Elvis film last week, where I think Baz Luhrmann didn't didn't portray the physical deterioration of Elvis in a way that we got used to, and that's another decision. I think it's a perfectly good decision. I loved the film actually. Anyway, yes, there's that lovely picture of Jackson. I mean, there can't be more than 30 pictures of Jackson, can there? And of course, there's no moving images, but there's got a nice picture of him looking very young and handsome. And I suppose from my perspective, I associate with of Jackson with the folk revival. Um, I think the folk revival means different things in the UK than it does in the US. I think when we think about the folk revival, we think about it generally. What does it mean to have a revival? I think what it means is people revisiting folk material that has arisen from kind of spoken word, working people's kind of lives. So I think that could be sea shanties, could be work songs, could be prison songs, could be kind of women songs, could be spirituals, and and I think when we think about folk revival in the US, we're thinking about something that started in the 40s. Um, and particularly with people like the Weavers and Pete Seeger. And I guess the other end of the spectrum, the more populist end of the spectrum, Kingston Trio. I mean, I think what's interesting about Pete Seeger, of course, is the kind of concerns about his left wing politics. There's some of that in the UK as well. Um, but I think about folk revival as being something that happened in the 60s in the UK, kind of based around London, not entirely. There were certainly some very notable folk performers based around the country. And here we go. I've got a bit of a picture. This is very much from a UK perspective. These are some folks. I'll go from the top left here. This is the Waterson family. This is Norma Waterson here recently, sadly died a couple of years back, and Martin Carthy, who's really one of the solid presences in UK folk music, and they were up there in the north of England. I always think it's interesting to talk about Martin Carthy in relation to Paul Simon, but let's talk about that later. Shirley Collins, oh, what a picture! Shirley Collins, nothing like pictures of women with banjos. Shirley Collins was obviously Alan Lomax's partner for a while, also partner of Ashley Hutchins, a great face in British folk music. And Shirley Collins lives not very far from where I live in Sussex. She lives in Lewes. She's still around, still performing, still making music. There we have, let me get out of the way. There we have, of course, Peggy Seeger. Pete Seeger's sister also lives in the UK. I lives up in Oxford, about sort of 60 miles away from where I am now. And Peggy was also, of course, the partner of Ewan McCall, a socialist, songwriter, playmaker, who obviously also wrote First Time I Ever Saw Your Face for Peggy. Ewan died some time ago. Peggy's still around. Met her a couple of years back. She's just such a character. Here we have Linda Thompson, known back in the 60s as Linda Peters, another absolutely fine songwriter from Scottish extraction. Linda also was a very good friend sorry, I'm trying to get my face back. A very good friend of Sandy Denny, and lived briefly in lodgings with Jackson C. Frank. She's the only person I was able to contact that I know about from all these people. And Linda, I contacted Linda because I know a little bit through my own kind of musical career. And she said that she felt she didn't know Jackson very well, and that he was a bit of a boozer, but then weren't we all? She said. I was particularly interested in talking to Linda because she was very close friends with this lady there, Sandy Denny, sadly died in 1978, but my favourite ever folk singer. Was concerned that I'd heard that Jackson had been horrible to Sandy, and Linda didn't bear that out. But Sandy and Jackson were an item for a while, as you probably know. Right here, this is Annie Briggs. Annie Briggs is a wonderful British singer who really unearthed a lot of the British traditional material, which became very much part of Sandy's repertoire. Annie made a couple of albums and then didn't make any more, and left the public eye, and I think went to farm in Scotland or something. But whoa, if you haven't heard her, really better sort her out. Here we are, John Martin. Now I have to talk about John and Beverly together, because Beverly is terrific. She lives again. She lives 7 miles away from me. A great British blues woman. Who sadly is now lost her sight, but she's still around and still performing and still terrific. She was John Martin's partner, husband, wife rather. John Martin very much knew Jackson, knew Nick Drake as well, wrote a song for Nick Drake. Jock was very, very abusive, all sorts of alcohol problems, and really abusive to Beverly, as she's told me. So what a shame. Beautiful, wonderful singer-songwriter, fantastic performer, wonderful guitar player, and there's a bit of something hanging over over his history there, his legacy, unfortunately. There's Nick Drake. I don't think Nick knew Jackson, but he certainly did some of Jackson's material. I don't think they ever met. Again, Nick Drake, made 3 albums, died young. Why do these people die young? Here we go. We have Paul McCartney and Art Garfunkel, and as you know, Paul McCartney, sorry, Paul Simon. That would have been a combination, wouldn't it? Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel. Paul Simon, of course, funded really Jackson's album and produced it. That one album that he made in his lifetime, and the funny thing about there's always a bit of a conversation going on about Paul, goody or baddie. Paul is said to have stolen Martin's arrangement of Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme. And of course he bought Jackson's rights to Jackson's songs off him, but they later returned them. So a complex character, but obviously a wonderful artist, both of them, and Art Garfunkel in their own right. John Renbourn there, fantastic guitar player. The person here in the end is Theo Bickel. Oh gosh, I hope I got that right. He used to run the Barge Folk Club in Kingston upon Thames. It's on the River Thames in London. One of the handful, really, of clubs in London which were around at the time. Coffee bars, really. Les Cousins. I always think that's funny because I imagine the people who opened Les Cousins thought that the coffee bar would be called Les Cousins, because that's the French. It's French. Les Cousins, Bungees, Two Eyes, and these are the places where Jackson went to when he arrived in London and started meeting these people and had that very brief starry career. So those are the folks I think are important. This is my own folk revival. I'm from Wales and I went to Aberdeen Boys Intermediate School, and the person who was responsible for bringing me attention to this is this guy, Bob Pritchard there. He was my physics and maths teacher. He can't remember me. I contacted him about this presentation. He's still alive. But at those days, end of term, special events, Bob would pull out his guitar and he would play songs from the folk revival. He would play Last Thing on My Mind. He played Desolation Row one day, I remember. And he'd play It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. He'd play Catch the Wind. But I particularly remember him playing Blues Run the Game, which is, I suppose, where my interest came from, really. And I was obsessive as a kid, as a musician. I wanted to play the guitar. I loved all sorts of music. And Bob Pritchard played a role about that. Can't remember anything about maths. Can't remember anything about science. Can't remember anything about physics. Can't remember anything about school. But I can remember Bob Pritchard playing Last Thing on My Mind. So, and I think that's what's important, actually, to be perfectly honest. My presentation's in 3 chunks, really. There's Jackson, very cute in a cowboy outfit, early years, and then again a wonderful kind of picture of how of a handsome youth playing Guild. Is it a Guild? I think it's a Guild. And there we are in 1998. A year or so before he died. Here's a very distressing picture about Jackson playing the guitar, and you'll see that we know that he lost his eye to a bizarre incident on the streets where he was shot by a kiddie with a pellet gun. And I'm denied about showing that picture because I think it's shocking, isn't it? That little photo montage. It's shocking to see. How he suffered, really. And I suppose I think Jackson's early life. I get the impression we know he was born. His mum was Marilyn. I hope I got that right. His dad was Jack Jones. Jack Jones was a pilot and a very charming, glamorous individual. I always think pictures of Marilyn. She always looks very, very glamorous and very smiley and very nice. Jack Jones is said to be a bit of a philanderer, and they divorced, and Marilyn married Elmer Frank, who, all intents and purposes, seemed like a really nice fella. Really took Jackson to his heart, and looked after him, and I think made a commitment not to have any other children and to devote himself to Jackson. Uh, I think that's a pretty good package there, really, isn't it? And I think, who would have known what would have happened to Jackson if it wasn't for the fire, the school fire, which I know many of you will know about. So in three chunks, this presentation really. So here we go. This is a picture of his class at the Cleveland Hills School in Buffalo, up in New York State, 1954, and we know that on that kind of fateful day. Very, very cold in Buffalo in the winter, wind blowing off the Great Lakes, snowy, icy outside. The school furnace is a boiler, as we would call it in the UK. Furnace was firing away all cylinders, keeping the school warm, but there was holes in the furnace, and fumes and coal dust was leaking out, had been for some time, into the rafters and parts in the school. And one day it blew up and sent a fireball throughout the school. And my impression is that most of the school managed to evacuate quite effectively, except for the music room, which was down a long corridor in a room which had no, I'm a great believer in health and safety. No fire doors, no fire exits, just children, a group of children in there, and adults, very, very vulnerable. I always like to pause to imagine what it would have been like to have been in that room on that day where that fire engulfed those children, and how horrifying, terrifying the sights, the sounds, the screaming, the pain. It's unimaginable, really. And I wonder if that didn't bring about, apart from the physical injuries in Jackson, a level of post-traumatic stress, which would have, had a big impact on the rest of his life, and his personality, his diagnosis of schizophrenia, depression. It's a horrible picture. So we know that the adults who were present were Miss Mary Lies, who was a supply teacher, and a chap whose name I can't remember, who was a choir gown salesman. Okay, I've never heard about a job like that, but they're in the school, they're in that room, the fire comes in, they try to get the kids out. Horrible, horrible, horrible. Mary Lies carried two children out while her daughter was still in the fire. What bravery. Jackson was carried out, laid in the snow, skin falling off. 57% of his body's covered in first, second, and third degree burns. And of course, his Marlene DuPont, who was his special friend and girlfriend at the time, she died in the fire, and I think he wrote a song about her later on, and I imagine sort of romantic and I don't know, sad and thoughtful ideas about that poor child for the rest of his life. Absolutely horrendous, hideous, awful things to happen. I think one of the things that reading about that led me to do is to look at the history of fires in the United States, but also it led me to the history of fires, school fires rather than the United States, but also school fires in the UK, which are really, really terrifying. Absolutely shocking event, which caught the national imagination, partly because of journalists, particularly I think from Time, who kind of forced their ways into hospital and took photographs, and so it became a kind of national news, really, a horrendous fire. But a lot of parents, particularly, were very, very upset that they'd not gone through proper channels and asking for permission. And all sorts of stuff happened then, didn't it? Because Jackson incredibly kind of survived it. I mean, he looks like an old man there, isn't he? But I imagine we're seeing sort of scarring from the fire, and there's his mum there smiling. What a attractive, kind of warm-looking person she was, sitting there talking to Kirk Douglas. And Kirk Douglas visited following this article and his knowledge, and I get the impression that Kirk Douglas, big film star at the time, um, continued to write to Jackson after this event. So it wasn't just a publicity stunt. I imagine his agent probably wanted it, but he did write to Jackson sometime afterwards, which was extraordinary, really. And of course, we all know this story. About that, actually Elvis wrote to Jackson as well, and sent him a card with his best wishes on, saying what a brave boy he was. And of course, tragically, um, later on in his life, Elvis sold that to. Sorry, Elvis didn't sell it. Jackson sold it to get for money for food when he was really down on his luck. This is really tragic, but this is the story as I understand it, is that Jackson's mum was a Civil War nut, and liked to visit Civil War battle sites. So and they were dry. They'd gone to the south. Just Jackson and I keep calling her Marilyn. I hope that's her name. I think that's her name. Anyway, they were driving in near Memphis, in Tennessee, and. And she remembered, I think, that they weren't far from Graceland, so they drove over towards Graceland, and that there was a man outside working a hedge, I think, and that person was. They stopped the car, and she went over to speak to him, and it was Vernon. It was Vernon Presley. It was Elvis's dad. And told Vernon who Jackson was, and he invited them into the house. And up the driveway into the house, those of you who've been to Graceland know this, I have. And Elvis was at the pool, and came out of the pool and chatted to Jackson. I suppose I get a sense there's young movie star Elvis there, and there's Jackson looking tense, I think, and a bit overawed, I imagine. I would have been, but there we are. That's summer of 1957. That's a fantastic photograph, isn't it? Really, truly, truly remarkable. Jackson then, at the age of 18, received, going forward quite a bit, obviously, a fire settlement of $100,000, which must have seemed to be a massive amount of money. And I think various people say that it kind of dominated his life, knowing that he was going to get this money. And as you all know, he kind of spent it as well. He spent lots of it on cars. He was fascinated with cars, and he bought cars. And it's one of the few photographs of the time. It's a very strange photograph, I think, of Jackson in front of a car, surrounded by cuddly toys, and a sword with stars and stripes attached to it. I've got no way of understanding that photograph, particularly what the context is. So if anybody got any interpretation of that, but what we've really got is a young man. Probably for me, has undiagnosed mental health problems. Yeah, maybe he's managing quite well. I don't know. Difficult to get much sense of it. His relationship with women, what he was doing with his time. We know that when he was in hospital, a teacher gave him a guitar, so presumably he was working on it. And of course, when we hear those recordings from 1965, he was a good guitar player. I mean, he was a great finger picker. It's very, considering the challenge of recording that material, the problems he had in the studio, that's very clean guitar picking and very accomplished singing as well. So I'm imagining he's working at this material quite a lot. And then obviously I'm jumping forward quite a bit. He goes to London, and a question people have asked me is, why did he go to London? And of course, one of the things that Jackson said is he went to London to get away from Dylan, which is a funny answer really, because Dylan was already there. And if you ever get, I was taken on a tour, a music tour by somebody in London, and we went to the clubs that I talked about earlier, but we also went around the back of the Savoy where Dylan recorded Subterranean Homesick Blues. So, it's around this sort of time. I might have been a bit earlier even. And Allen Ginsberg's in the background. Dylan had sort of come and gone, but maybe Jackson knew about the scene in London. It was a perfect scene. It's exactly the kind of scene you want to be involved in. It's small. There's 5-6 clubs. There's probably 30 musicians. You can find your way around that quite quickly. And maybe he knew that Paul Simon was there as well, because of course the meeting with Paul Simon is very, very important. Jackson would have been turning up at clubs doing floor spots. It's the standard. It's the way we do it now in the UK. People turn up, you do 2-3 songs to open for the main act, and eventually somebody offers you the main gig. And that's what happened to Jackson. And through that process, he met Paul Simon. And Paul Simon, I think, had got some money from the Paul Simon songbook at that point. There's a version of Sounds of Silence, not the one that was later became famous with Art Garfunkel, but he had some money, and he offered to fund and record the album, the Jackson C. Frank album, which we all know and love. I don't know where that photograph was taken. I'd like to know. I wonder if it's in New York. I wonder if it's on one of the wharfs. I'm not sure. I'd like to know that actually. I don't think it says it on the album. And we know about the story of it being recorded over a day. We know that Jackson really struggled with being in the studio and had to have blankets hung up so that people couldn't see him and he couldn't see other people when he was recording. Paul Simon and Al Stewart, who later became very famous with a song called "Year of the Cat" in the UK. I don't know how that went in the US, but played a bit of additional guitar. I believe that Art Garfunkel was in the studio as well. Um, it's the singing and playing on that record and the songwriting on that record is second to none, really. And I guess if there's a reason for for telling people about Jackson, I think it's that album. What a fine album it is. Um, uh, and uh, and of course, it flopped. Nobody bought it, sadly. And then you've already got a situation of Jackson records out. He's in London, and money's running out. And then, of course, what we know is then he goes back to the US, kind of with very little to show, other than some great experiences, I hope. And then comes back to the UK. And by 1966, everything had kind of changed. The Beatles have made Rubber Soul. Dylan's gone electric. Things have changed. The psychedelia, the coffee scene is changed. People who are involved, like Joe Boyd, who was involved, of course, with Sandy Denny, but also the McGarrigle sisters, and gosh, going back, Sandy Terry and Brownie McGee, and all sorts of people. He'd opened the Middle Earth Club at this time, and everybody was going along there to see Pink Floyd and crazy light shows and a very different kind of scene. So he finds himself back in the US, and I guess it's the bit that I'm going to, jump through quite quickly, um, and um, uh, and settles in Woodstock. Um, and there's greater tragedy awaiting him here, doesn't he? Marries Elaine Sedgwick, who's I think Edie is a relation of Edie Sedgwick, who was one of the key players or one of Warhol's Factory. I'm guessing that Elaine Sedgwick must have been fairly kind of well off and fairly affluent. We know they have two children, and we know that the boy dies as an infant of cystic fibrosis, and we know there's a daughter, and we know that the ongoing relationship is really difficult. But we already have started to hear stories about Jackson being thought of as odd in up in Woodstock, and things become really difficult with his mum and Elma. They continue to be supportive. My sense of it is that lots of people were drawn to Jackson and wanted to help him. And my sense of it is he wasn't always able to accept that help. And then what we got through the 70s and then into the 80s is this terrible um, disintegration into mental health problems, us living on the street, horrible stuff, and there's a picture of I missed that picture of Sandy Denny, who's my favourite ever recording artist. If you're a Jackson fan and you haven't listened to any Sandy Denny, then you really should. She did some lovely covers of his songs. They were only an item for a while, and she died in '78, kind of tragically. But what a wonderful singer! What a wonderful, she liked to drink. She was a party girl. Unfortunately, things didn't work out. She'd still be with us today, and that breaks my heart anyway. So we're back to Jackson. So we're into these awful pictures. He's living he's living in the streets in New York. We know that he went to see went to see. That's annoying me. That problem there. Hold on. We know that we know he went to see Paul Simon and sold the rights to his songs. We know he was desperate. I love the stories about how he would, which I think was an insight into how clever he was. I believe those pictures of Jim Abbott as well, aren't they? I think we know how clever he was. He was taking typewriters out of dumpsters and repairing them. We know that he told people that he knew Paul Simon and nobody believed him. It's kind of really shocking and really horrible. We know that he tried to link in to get with his mother, particularly around a time when his mother was had a heart attack and was really ill. And it seemed to me that Jackson really couldn't respond really. To his mum, and it all seems to me like somebody who's so traumatized, and brings on other issues like substance misuse, and I mean it's just heartbreaking, isn't it? Various people have a crack, including Jim Abba, are kind of rescuing Jackson, but it wasn't going to happen. He loses his eye. It's that awful scene where he's urinated in his bed and dries his sheets over a radiator, and that nearly brings about another fire. Um, Kind of horrible and dangerous and upsetting, and it's very difficult, I think, to look back on that and bring meaning. And I suppose the only thing that really does it for me, and I was so disappointed when I couldn't find the quote, um, was Bert Jansch. If you go back and find out about what Bert Jansch, who was a fine guitar player, and carried on doing the things that Jackson did, the troubadour, the lonesome, denim wearing guitar player, absolute genius, a guitar player, alcoholic, suffered greatly. But why? If we listen to Bert Jansch talk about Jackson as an influence, and he loved Jackson, and I suppose what I did in my presentation was I played Don't Look Back over your shoulder, keep your eyes on freedom shore, because I felt at that moment that Jackson wrote that song, and the moment that he sang it, in terms of being part of a movement of young people using art and music to create a better world, I think that he had it at that moment. I think he was motivated, and I think he was connected, and I only wish that it would have lasted. Um, there we go. That's my presentation about Jackson. Like I say, I don't know if I got all that right. I've certainly missed stuff out. I remain a fan. I remain someone who whips out that record and puts it on and just languishes in the clear light of genius of Jackson C. Frank. Thank you ever so much, everyone, and have a good day. And yeah, stay well. Thanks a lot.